Is security through obscurity a lie? We'll explain what that is coming soon. And also, if we were asked to help draft privacy regulations, what would we want to see? And a big announcement before we get into this Q&A, which came from our patrons. From here on out, we now have a new way for you to ask us questions, which is through XMR chat. Pretty much you can now ask us questions by tipping us Monero. So we kind of wanted to combine the privacy of Monero as well as giving you all a way to ask us a question without needing the recurring subscription of Patreon. Obviously, we're going to prioritize patrons as much as we can, so Patreon is still going to be our main platform, but we are going to try to experiment to see how many messages and questions we get on XMR chat. So no promises yet on how we're going to sift through the questions. But if you're interested in asking a question and Patreon was what was holding you back before, check out XMR chat down in the description and go ahead and ask your question and we'll figure out what to do with what we see for next week's Q&A.
Also, real quick, just for those who are like, well, then why would I keep paying for Patreon? Because you also get the Signal group chat. So just wanted to throw that out there.
David Johnson. I'm just going to TLDR this question. A common thing that I hear, and probably many people who are in the community here, is people who say security by obscurity is a bad thing and isn't real security. What this means for people who don't know is security by obscurity is essentially where there isn't any inherent security benefit to what you're doing outside of the fact that you're obfuscating the use of the tool. So where we kind of see this play out on a technical level is people will say things, and again, I'm generalizing a lot of arguments here, but people will say things like, well, Linux isn't inherently any more secure, and the only security Linux provides is because it's a less popular operating system that's not targeted by most malicious actors, because Windows and macOS are more popular, so they're just going to develop malware for those platforms, and you're pretty much just gaining security by obscurity by not using a major platform that's impacted by the malware. Our opinions on the subject is what David is asking for on this, the people who say that security by obscurity is bad and should be avoided. Seems like we're pretty much in agreement. I'll start with my opinion, and then Nate can kind of add on what he thinks. Our minds both went to the same place when we talked about this beforehand. I think if you rely on security by obscurity as your only way to stay secure, I think that's bad. Eventually, it's going to catch up to you, and it's not good. With that said, I think that security through obscurity is a super massively important thing that can add a massive layer of protection to what you're doing. And I think that it's probably too vilified. I think it's bad if it's the only thing, but if it's a part of your workflow, it can actually be a really major part of your workflow. And we see this in a lot of areas, and even governments do probably over-rely on security by obscurity in a lot of ways. So I don't think it's a good example, but a lot of things don't even come to light for a long time because they just are hidden and no one knew about them. And actually, security through obscurity kind of worked for a long while. So I think security through obscurity can actually prolong and make things a little bit more challenging for people. And that's how I personally look at it. It's a tool, just like every other tool, and it can help things out, but you should never over-rely on it. But I think it probably gets a little too much hate because it can be a really valuable tool.
I don't have too much to add. We really do have similar philosophies on that. Defense in depth is a really big concept that I don't think gets talked about enough, at least not from what I've seen. I can do the data removal thing, whether I use a service or do it manually, whatever. And that's security through obscurity, which is great. I can also do a lot of disinformation. Like I could start planting information that says I live in Utah or New York or things like that. I could put my home in an LLC or a trust, which makes it that much harder to look up on people's search websites, things like that. So, which I guess is still kind of security through obscurity, but you know what I mean? It's like, it's not relying on a single technique. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism comes from is I think a lot of the people who are depending on security through obscurity are depending on that one thing to save them. And it's like, no, that's not always going to be enough because that's what actually won me over to the privacy movement is the argument of the defender needs to get it right every single time. The attacker only needs to get it right once. It's definitely part of a defense. I'm a big fan of it, but it is not the whole defense. We only had 2 questions this week. Well, kind of 3 because Apricot asked 2 questions here, but they're very closely related. The first question is, if you were asked to help draft privacy regulations, what regulations would you want to see? A lot of people, when we mention GDPR, they're just like, well, GDPR it's not really that good. It's better than nothing. And as an American without anything, I'm kind of jealous. I'll admit that. Okay, so the big thing that we're not seeing in the US right now with a lot of these privacy regulations that I would love to see, private right of action. That really pisses me off. For those who don't know, there's a lot of state-by-state privacy laws popping up in the US right now, but a good chunk of them say like individuals can't sue the company. They have to go to their state's attorney general, who then has to sue the company. And the attorney general is already overwhelmed, underfunded. So it's going to take a lot of work to get the attorney general to get off their ass and do something, because they've just got too much other stuff going on. So I would love to see individuals be able to just directly go to the company and be like, hey, screw you, I'm taking you to court. I would also like to see, we covered, I think last week or the week before, there was a story about how they've, I think it was Illinois, redid their privacy law where now you can't sue per offense, you can only sue per category of offense. So let's say I uploaded 50 pictures to Facebook. Facebook used all 50 of those to train their AI. I say, hey, I never consented to that. Instead of suing them 50 times, I can only sue them once. Anything we can do to put the most hurt on these companies is definitely a win. Other than that, I mean, just a lot of like, right to know what data companies have on you, right to correct it or delete it, right to be forgotten. Something that outlaws people search websites and data brokers, getting consent in a non-obnoxious way. I don't know if you guys know, but those cookie banners, first of all, they're dark patterns because it's like, click here to say yes, click here to manage your preferences, and we're going to take you to 6 other menus where you have to uncheck everyone individually. Like, screw you, man. I'm on my phone. I'm not going to do that. But also, they don't have to do a cookie banner that takes up the whole screen and won't let you proceed until you do something with it. They do it on purpose to be maliciously compliant, so they can be like, well, we don't want to bother you, but we have to because of regulations. They don't have to be difficult about it. They choose to be difficult. So I would like to see something that addresses that.
On that note, just to deal with that right away, I feel like malicious compliance needs to be extremely penalized. And I think what really speaks to this is Apple and the EU right now with all of the DMA stuff going on. That's just inappropriate. I think that when regulations are passed, they need to be followed, and companies that are actively trying to skirt around it by just making things difficult for everybody downplays the regulation in the first place. And I would argue that that's why a lot of people say, well, regulation doesn't work. Look, they still do this and this and this. And it's like, well, actually, you still have some more legal rights. They wouldn't have rolled out some improvements if it weren't for those. But companies who are really good at doing this are good at weaponizing regulation to make it seem like services are getting worse because of governments instead of because of their own doing. Kind of expanding on what Nate said in terms of opting out, this is a bit of a hot take and it might be too extreme. So, this is just us kind of throwing our opinions out there. I think that providers need to have a requirement that users can opt out without losing a single function of the app, because that's a very common dark pattern. A good example of this, Tesla. Tesla lets you opt out of all the data collection, but it means you don't have warranty on your car anymore. You lose access to service centers, you lose access to every feature on the car, etc. So it's this thing where you're pretty much forced to either, say goodbye to every feature of a car, or you have privacy. And that is a false dichotomy that does not need to exist. The middle ground is the company actually to put in work to make it privacy respecting and still offer users the option to opt out. And then maybe for actual, let's say it's actually impossible to not collect some user data and it would be misleading to consider it an opt-out, then companies have to have those cleared on a case-by-case basis. This is all like in my head, very idealistic, because obviously this would create tremendous overhead for governments that they don't want to deal with. And then I think the last thing I'd love to see, again, besides all the stuff that Nate mentioned, is more regulation around terms. I've been comparing privacy to food a lot recently, and maybe it's partly because at the time we record this, I never have dinner. So I think that might have something to do with it. But I know not too long ago, I talked about how, and I think Nate's talked about this too, like the reason why you can go to the grocery store and have with a large deal of certainty that what you buy is going to be safe and not kill you is because of some basic laws and regulation that kind of keep that industry regulated, which we don't see in the privacy space. Similarly, there's a lot of terms in the food industry that have to be at least somewhat accurate, and there's stamps of approval and things like that. So for example, we used this example not so long ago, you can't call something vegan and it's not vegan. And where I see this be a problem and why this is, I think, one of the biggest issues in the privacy space in general is companies like Facebook say that they're privacy respecting, but there's no definition on what privacy respecting means. And so there has to be a way to regulate companies and withhold certain terms from being used in advertising that actually have nothing to do with their service. It's a really hard thing to regulate, but I think there's some really obvious people who abuse this. I think that if we were to actually iron out terms and made it so people can't use terms willy-nilly, it would be a lot harder to mislead a massive number of people into thinking that a service actually protects them and their data.
And the second part of Apricot's question is apricot. Why am I saying apricot? Can privacy regulation help protect users who don't follow best practices? Now, specifically, you mentioned things like password managers with unique passwords and 2FA. Can privacy regulation help protect users? Yes. We just saw that this week, actually, with Discord rolling out end-to-end encryption. And we talked about Meta rolling out end-to-end encryption for Facebook messages, WhatsApp, Discord. Those are things that users don't have to do anything. It just automatically works. And if their stuff ever gets hacked, you can't recover those messages. We don't have to worry about the content of those messages being sold. The example I like to cite, and this is a really dark example, so I apologize. I'm not condoning any of what I'm about to say. Somebody did an investigative journalism piece where they purchased the phone location data for every phone that went in and out of Epstein's Island. Only the people in Europe, as soon as their phones hit European airspace, the location data stopped, which tells me that those people never went into their phones and turned off location tracking. GDPR regulation required that data not to be saved and therefore couldn't be sold to the person who bought it. It just proves the point. Regulation works. It does protect people for better or worse. And I think there's some gray areas. You talk about like password managers. Can regulation fix that? Maybe. I mean, like we've had a few breaches that we've covered over the years, plain text passwords or using deprecated hashes like MD5. You could have regulations that require companies to use. And the thing is, like, regulations are slow as hell. So you never want to introduce a law that says like, oh, you have to use SHA-512. Because by the time that regulation gets passed, SHA itself is going to be freaking deprecated and we're going to be moved on to something else, like, bcrypt, for example. So you don't want to be that specific, but you do want to pass, and this is how we start getting loopholes in laws. You want to pass regulations that say things like the best recommended practice. Well, recommended by who? What is the best? Like, there's definitely a way to do it that I think would majority benefit people.
Yeah, on my end, I'd start by saying that right now, if you're in a state in the US where there is no privacy regulation and something really bad happens to you, like someone just steals your data, posts it online publicly, you have no real legal power in that situation. And what regulation does is it gives you the legal ability to hold people accountable, even if it's not you, because you mentioned, to help protect users who don't follow best practices. So let's assume someone who doesn't even know. The fact that someone else who does know can hold that company accountable can also help protect everybody. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is that kind of accountability is indirect. Companies will now have to think about this a little bit more because there's actual consequences for being a bad company. So this does help people who don't follow best practices because companies now will feel more pressure to actually roll out more privacy respecting technologies and treat data more seriously, because if they mess up, the difference is they're going to be fined a ton of the profits of their company instead of the previous consequence was just, oh, we might get some Twitter outrage for a few days and then whatever, it's going to blow over. The third thing, to kind of finish that out and to finish my points out, is I see regulation a lot like how I see security through obscurity, the other question. It's one tool that you can use to help guarantee your privacy. And neither Nate nor myself nor anyone we know has ever said that regulation is going to fix every privacy problem, but none of us have ever said that technology alone will fix every privacy problem. I actually really like what the Calyx Institute says. It's a combination of three things. It's a combination of education, technology, and legal activism. And there's other things you can argue deserve to be in that little triangle as well, but I think those are three starting points to really make a big difference for the most number of people out there. Those are all the questions we have this week. So I hope that you kind of got some good opinions on our end about what we think about regulations and what privacy regulation can look like. And then we also talked about security through obscurity, two somewhat hot topics. So we'll see how everyone takes this one. But anyway, no matter who you are, I still want to thank you for listening to what we have to say and our opinions. I really appreciate it. So thank you for tuning in, asking questions, listening to us, and we really appreciate that. And if you want to ask a question and get some more opinions, you can do that on patreon.com/surveillancepod. The Q&A is already live. So if you were listening to this and you're like, oh my God, what do they think about this? What are their bad takes on this? You can leave that on Patreon. Or there's now XMR chat, like I mentioned earlier, which is a way for you to just tip us a little bit of Monero and then leave us a question. Again, it's a brand new platform. We don't know how many people are going to send us questions. We don't know if we're going to have a minimum for the amount of Monero to send us, because we don't want people just spamming 100 questions per week and just sending us 1 cent in Monero. So we just don't know what that's going to look like yet. So that's to be decided. That's all I got. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week on Surveillance Report.